Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you for your patience. We had a little technical glitch there behind the scenes. I think we are all set to go. My name is Hillary Stevens. I'm the Coastal Resilience Manager here at Restore America's Estuaries. And this is our webinar series, the March edition, called So You Want to Start a Restoration Project. Today, we have a very experienced panel of folks who have been conducting restoration projects all around the country that are going to be talking about a toolkit that we put together, we have on a website available that has just lots and lots of resources available. This panel discussion is going to be moderated by my colleague, Elsa Schwartz. Before I turn the microphone over, a brief introduction to Restore America's Estuaries. We are a national nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. We serve as a member organization, an alliance of our member groups. We have 10 organizations located around the country that you see here that are working in their local areas to protect and restore their coastal resources. And we are a convener and an advocate for these groups, providing expertise and information as well as education to lawmakers here in the nation's capital. Here are our panelists. We have Modjeski from the American Littoral Society, Tracy Skrabal from the North Carolina Coastal Federation, and Philip from the Galveston Bay Foundation. We'll be hearing more about them shortly. With that, let me turn it over to Elsa.
All right, so you want to start a restoration project. That's a common theme or question that comes up a lot in our work. And judging by the interest in this webinar, you are not alone in having questions. How do you develop a coastal restoration project, and where do you go for answers? What about permitting? How do you find out who to contact? Or what about invasive plants or coastal erosion, flooding? Where do you find project examples? Next slide, please. With the support of NOAA Fisheries Office of Habitat Conservation Restoration Center, we developed a website called the Coastal Restoration Toolkit to provide answers to those questions. This website can be found at restoreyourcoast.org. The website is an online toolkit for taking action to restore your coastline. It's divided into 5 main topic areas: flooding, coastal erosion, water quality, invasive species, and wildlife habitat. And each topic represents a problem you have seen along your coastline and is a launching point for developing solutions. Next slide. When you go to the website's homepage, this is what you'll see, and you'll find that the topic areas are along the top there, and each is broken into subcategories that include tools and resources, contacts, funding resources, permitting info, and project examples. And the invasive species and wildlife habitat section are further broken down into regionally specific subcategories. And also on the home page, down at the bottom there, you'll see a video that is an overview of the toolkit. And we are going to play that video for you now.
Welcome to the Coastal Restoration Toolkit. Here, you'll find the tools you need to start a coastal restoration project in your community, addressing erosion, restoring wildlife habitat. The toolkit is your launching point. There are 5 main topics: flooding, coastal erosion, water quality, invasive species, and wildlife habitats. Each topic represents a problem you may have seen along your coastline. Invasive species and wildlife habitats are further broken down by region. First, access topics and their resources by hovering over the menu. For invasive species and wildlife habitats, you can access a region-specific subtopic by selecting it in the menu, or use the interactive map by selecting the subtopic directly. Next, visit your topic's overview page. For example, let's look at flooding. On the flooding overview page, you'll see links to each type of resource for your topic across the top. Keep in mind that you can print, save, or share using links at the top right. Let's explore project examples for some that have already been completed. In the right-hand sidebar, you'll see toggle style buttons for topic, region, and tags. Use these to refine your search results or use the search bar. Lastly, use the FAQs with their quick find feature for more help. Good luck with your coastal restoration project.
All right, again, the website is restoreyourcoast.org, and we invite you to go to the website, check it out. We welcome feedback. There's a survey you can fill out to offer your suggestions for more information or ways to improve the toolkit. Next slide. Another great resource for getting your questions answered is to attend our summit on coastal habitat restoration. We've had 10 summits so far, and our 11th summit will be towards the end of the year next year. Stay tuned for more details on exactly when and where that summit will be. Next slide. Our summit is the largest gathering of the coastal management and restoration community and is a great place to hear lessons learned and hear about the latest and greatest in habitat restoration projects. There's an expo hall, plenaries, breakout sessions, poster hall, networking event, and we actually do a hands-on restoration project as well. Next slide. But you all have the wonderful opportunity to directly interact with an experienced panel of top experts in the field. Now, I've done the math, and between us, we have nearly 100 years of experience working in the field of coastal habitat restoration. So we are going to start by having our panel of experts introduce themselves, tell us where they are from, what type of restoration projects they generally work on, and what organization they are with. And Tracy, let's start with you.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. This looks like a well-attended group, and thank you. And I'm happy to be here with some very experienced colleagues. My name is Tracy Skrabal, and I'm a coastal scientist with the North Carolina Coastal Federation. And we're one of the Restore America's Estuaries partners and have been since its inception. So we benefit from being in this partnership very much. The Coastal Federation was founded as an advocacy organization. We are a 501c3, but we have gotten very involved in restoration, both small scale and large scale, for over a decade, actually closer to 2 decades now. And we have experts that work in many different fields of restoration, including oyster reef restoration, living shorelines, large scale wetlands restoration projects, multi-phase, tidal creek, some up to nearing 6,000 acres, one of our projects, down to residential scale living shoreline projects. So happy to be here today and contribute to the conversation.
Thanks, Tracy. All right, Captain Al, would you like to introduce yourself? Oh, Captain Al, we're having a little trouble with your audio. Are you unmuted? Still having trouble with your audio.
How about now?
There we go. Welcome.
Okay. It said I was muted by the organizer. So I'm Captain Al. I just want you to know that I am not the 100 years of experience. I'm not that old. So it's good to be here collectively with everybody else, with Tracy and Philip. And just give you an idea, I'm the Habitat Restoration Program Director for the American Littoral Society. We're stationed out of Sandy Hook National Park or recreational area in New Jersey. And the stuff that I do pretty much is from whether it's a living shoreline, beach restoration, or marsh restoration. We do fish passage work. We're just getting ready to finish up another maritime forest and some dune plantings. And then we also do shoreline stabilization kind of projects and beneficial reuse of dredge material. So I want to thank everybody for having me here today, and I hope we have some really cool dialogue.
Great, thanks. All right, Philip, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Philip Smith. I'm the Director of Habitat Restoration for the Galveston Bay Foundation. We're also a nonprofit founded in 1987. I think we've been doing habitat restoration since the late 90s. I think 98 or 99 was our first project. I primarily work on our large-scale habitat restoration projects, mainly intertidal wetlands. We have other folks on staff that do oyster restoration, land conservation, prairie restoration, freshwater wetland restoration, things of that nature. We also have a great education program here at the foundation. Do lots of things, and I've been with the foundation since 2006. And we work to enhance and preserve Galveston Bay, and with that, we're kind of, as far as geography, we are limited in our work area to the lower Galveston Bay watershed, and primarily in the 4 counties that touch the bay.
Great, thanks. Really appreciate you all being here today. And so we have a couple questions to kick things off, but I want to invite the audience members to type your questions into the chat box. You have, like I said, 100 years worth of experience here at your disposal. So please, this is your chance to stump the expert. So ask some tough questions and tell us what challenges you may be facing in your areas. So to get things started, one of the biggest questions is, I want to do a restoration project, and how do I start? Any advice?
I'll go ahead and start, guys. Well, to start a restoration project, you have to have an idea, and you have to have an area that you see that may be either vulnerable or needs restoration. When we start a project, we engage the stakeholders off right in the beginning, and then once that idea, we grow it into more a concept, and that concept then we can take to funders. Now we have a funded idea that we look at, and we go ahead and put it together with some risk contingencies, because with every restoration project, you may have some risk involved that may delay your timeline or something like that. So you put that all together, then you find your partners that you think can help you actually organize and get this project in the ground, and go from there. That's kind of how we do it, and it starts from, it actually also can start too from a restoration project you've seen. And I did want to say that at the Ray Summits, and I think I've been to all 10, at the Ray Summits, we get a lot of ideas from others across the nation. So one of our projects we have incorporates stuff being done down in New Orleans and stuff being done in the Great Lakes. So it's great to interact with everybody today. And once we hear about these things, we say, how can we apply some of that stuff we've learned on a national level to the local level?
And I think that's a very common set of steps that Captain Al has mentioned. I'd say from our standpoint, one of the most important things is scaling up through numbers of partnerships, because we are a staff of 30, and of those 30, a handful of us do restoration across all of North Carolina's coastal region. So it's really important to us to develop these partnerships so that we really can increase all of our the benefit to the ecosystem for restoration, for funding, for all of those benefits.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same here for us as well. It's, hey, what's the problem? Let's identify the problem. A tool that I use for every single project is Google Earth. It's a great program. You can go back, take the timeline back in time, so you can bring up that site, see what it looked like 50 years ago in some cases, which is a lot of times kind of what we aspire to do, is take that habitat back to what it was X number of years ago, maybe to the 1950s, something like that. And then you just try to determine, hey, what could be causing this issue, and what may be a couple of techniques that could address, the issue that's causing, the loss of habitat or erosion, whatever the case may be for that project. And then, like everyone has said, and the thing, you can't do these projects without partners. So, we'll start talking to a partner here and there and getting their input. And, if we can get buy-in from multiple partners, it just gets it to a point to where we can start crafting grant applications and things like that, and have support of the local partners, federal, state agencies, other NGOs in the region, and it really helps to move the project forward.
Great. What do you guys find when you're doing your restoration projects? What do you find is the biggest hurdle or the biggest challenge to completing a restoration project?
I'd say, go ahead.
Tracy. All right.
I was just
no
going to say
worries.
one thing that is typically challenging, and again, the partnerships become really important, is developing a timeline that is realistic and that matches your funding opportunities, your seasonal constraints, availability of partners, permitting, all those kind of things. If you develop this sort of system of steps that you go through over time, you start to build in extra time. It always takes longer than you think, but I would say that's the number one thing, is getting all of your timelines to mesh well.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Have a timeline set up, but that timeline has to be flexible. Because as you go through, as I mentioned in the opening statements here, risk contingencies. One risk could be a challenge, could be in the regulatory piece, possibly, and that could hold you up by 6 months. It could also be another that maybe you missed your window to do, say, a submerged aquatic vegetation survey, but now you find out that that area is historically mapped as SAV. So now you have to, what you thought you're going to do in the spring gets pushed past the window where you have to do that kind of a survey. So that's one thing I was thinking of. And then another one is, for a better choice of words, is rumor control. You want to have regular stakeholder meetings. You want to engage your stakeholders, because your project can take on a life of its own. That's not the project that you're doing. And sometimes that comes through stakeholders not being informed. So communication is a key element in any restoration, whether it's for the stakeholders and doing, bi-monthly or quarterly meetings, or just having a technical advisory committee and informing everyone and keeping the regulators in on that to say, here's the process and here's the project as it evolves and unfolds.
Yeah, I would say the partnerships, like you said, Captain Niles, pretty important piece there. And, the technical advisory committees are pretty much part of every project we do that way. And it makes the permitting process a little easier here anyway, because most of those agencies and organizations that will review those permit applications are at the table from day one. So they've already seen it. It's not something new. We get their comments up front. So we're not trying to do that within the permitting process itself. But the biggest obstacle for us is just funding. Because to even get to the permitting stage on most of our projects, you have to have some sort of funding source in place, depending on the project, especially if it's a larger project. So it's the funding source, and in particular, if you have a source that needs match, whether you need federal match or non-federal match, sometimes you may have several pots of federal funding in a project, and the non-federal stuff may be harder to come up with. So that's always a big challenge for us.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that, Philip. The match portion of it, if you're looking at like non-federal match or what have you, depending on the size of your project, cobbling that together sometimes can take a little time. Matching the in-kind services that you need, especially during COVID right now, taking volunteers and things like that, has made it a little more challenging, to get some of that match on the in-kind side. So now you're looking more for that cash match and really shaking the trees to hopefully have that fall out so you complete your project.
Yeah, and it also affects your timelines, because all these different grants or sources of funds have to, one may expire a year from now, one may be 2 years from now. And, it's all the timelines for your funding sources and, the realistic implementation timeline all have to, intermingle.
Yeah, no doubt.
I would just add that most of our probably without exception, all of our funding sources are really like-minded folks who want us all to succeed. And so having conversations with them early and often about match options and being creative around timelines, all those sort of things, the more you're able to do that, the more successful you're going to be around all these things, because really these folks, they really want the same things we want in terms of restoration. So we've been really pleasantly surprised and pleased how flexible and how involved our funding folks are when it comes to all of these challenges.
Yeah, definitely talk to the grantors, whenever you can. because, you know, sometimes you're going to be thrown a little bit of a curveball. The work that we do down in Delaware Bay, I mean, that's a very dynamic system. What we're grant funded for in 1 year, a year later, that could change, and there may be another area that's even more vulnerable. And then that's when we reach out to our grantors and say, hey, we want to move the scope, you know, change this scope a little bit to address what's happening right now. And then we can come back and prepare the rest of that and become more programmatic in our approach, you know, in the face of sea level rise and climate change. But this is something we have to do right now. So that's a really, really good statement, Tracy and Philip.
So you mentioned COVID, and I know that's kind of always the elephant in the room, right? Everyone's, you know, has to make changes because of COVID. You mentioned that it impacts match for volunteers. So how else has COVID impacted your restoration projects, or any advice for continuing to do restoration projects in light of COVID, especially with working with volunteers?
For us, we've completed one construction project and we have one currently ongoing. And it kind of delayed the start of construction just due to some delay in materials availability, things of that nature on the construction side. But, you know, once they get going, they've been good. You know, fortunately, the contractors we've worked with, they're smaller, so they have a smaller workforce. They can take the precautions and haven't really been affected outside of the, you know, the materials availability aspect. And, you know, as far as the, you know, more community-based stuff using volunteers, you know, it's been tough. But for a while there, I mean, we couldn't do anything. I mean, it was completely shut down. And I think, you know, internally we may have promoted like virtual trash cleanups and things of that nature to keep people engaged, because they want to be engaged. I mean, that's what we found out is folks, even though they were, you know, especially when they're locked up in their house for, you know, for 2 or 3 months, and they want to get outside and help. So in early fall, we were able to do some small group things where we arranged it to where, hey, we didn't have groups that were more than, say, 10 people in size. And just for instance, marsh grass planting, where you normally work in pairs, we just made sure that the pairs that worked together came together. So they were family units, so that, you know, we weren't just intermingling, you know, normal Joe public together and just trying to take precautions with the mask and things of that nature. Just doing the best we could, because people definitely want to do it.
And we've done the same thing. I mean, obviously pivoting is the key this year. And again, back to the funders, they've been so great about allowing us to fill those numbers that we previously said we would hit with match for volunteers in other ways, like people educated or our outreach exercises. And we've also, because we have a policy in-house of not doing live events, even now, other than small, we've connected with community groups that will do them independently for us or on our projects. But they are, as Philip said, they're sort of intact units. They could be a small garden club or families. And so we've been able to work with them virtually to set them up, but we don't have our 50, 100 person volunteer events. So we've relied more on contractors, and we've paid out more for that work that we would normally do with volunteers. And we hope that doesn't continue, but you know, we're all in the same boat.
Yeah, I would say that, you know, for those, even though I'm in New Jersey, for those of you in Texas, you might actually appreciate this. We do what's called the Earl Campbell pivot. So we think ahead of the game and how we're going to score that touchdown. You know, what happens on some of our projects, and we've experienced during COVID, where one project we're building a fish ladder, and a manufacturer that created this Alaska Steep Pass for us to go up over this dam. We ordered everything in advance of COVID. We had everything delivered, but when we needed extra parts and things like that and other things fabricated, they were already out of business as a manufacturer, which was kind of tough on us. But we relied on our local communities and our local fabricators and you know, our other subcontractors they had to build these parts and craft them in that kind of a face of project, you know, dilemma. So again, we had some risk contingencies, and we had set them up in place. So that was important. The other thing is, you know, with labor from our subcontractors, they're out there one day and the next day they're not, because they've all got COVID. So what do? That sets you back another 2 weeks, another 4 weeks maybe on your project, and you might lose that window based on your permit conditions of when you can do that work, you know? And again, like you guys already mentioned, the outreach has been a little bit difficult, but at the same time, that challenge has been met. And by creating these virtual platforms that are engaging and bringing people there on the site, you know, at their home, that's important. One thing I think COVID-19 has shown and proven is the value of habitat restoration and the value of nature to engage people. People want to get outside. They want to be outside. They want to keep being outside. They can help us in the community to do these restoration projects. They're going to come out and look after the fact. They're going to come out with their families, like you said, Philip and Tracy. The value of nature based on COVID is huge. I mean, I was talking to a park ranger in Jamaica Bay a few weeks back, and even though they're understaffed, their visitation there has tripled since COVID. So people want to get outside, and that to me is very important as a restoration practitioner, because now I know at least some of the goods and services I'm providing to people is getting out there and having some recreational kind of passive kind of things they can do there.
Yeah, I've talked about the importance of engaging partners, engaging the community, especially in times of COVID. Do you have any advice for bringing in or engaging non-traditional partners in coastal habitat restoration work?
In which way do you mean non-traditional?
I mean, that can be kind of communities that you don't normally work with. It can be communities of color. It can be, you know, communities who maybe underserved, traditionally aren't involved in restoration projects.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, that virtual platform that we've been creating has really opened up that to everyone. You know, we're not isolated. We're not siloed anymore. And as one person clicks on something, say on YouTube, and they say, hey, wow, that's pretty cool, it passes on, and it kind of sends that ripple effect across the nation to kind of hit everybody that's thinking about what is restoration. And even if it's on the coast, how does that apply to myself, say I'm in Indiana, you know, and how do I engage? So I think our outreach, or at least the reach of restoration because of COVID and through social media, has grown and expanded.
And on the non-traditional partners, so our education programs in schools, which we link sometimes to our restoration programs, we now really have targeted Title I schools for a number of years. There are often opportunities for our public and private schools in all of our communities that don't exist for some of these Title I schools. So we've made conscious decisions to do that. The other thing, because we are an advocacy organization that also does education restoration, I love it when we partner with groups that we might not necessarily agree with on some of our advocacy, because once you get to know each other, it's really hard to dig in. And so that's helped us. And the other thing is we really partner with the military quite a bit on some of our restoration projects, and you cannot understate the importance of a Marine who can carry 10 bags of oyster shells at one time to my 1 bag of oyster shell. And they're happy to do it. And they're, you know, and so I encourage you all to reach out to them. They're often looking for community opportunities.
And I think for us as well, you know, our education program is the key to get into the Title I schools and that sort of thing. It's a little different now with COVID, since you can't really do hands-on as much. But to get those type of kids out and get them, you know, we'll take them to a nursery where they harvest the smooth cordgrass, you know, from the nursery. And, you know, they've never done that type of thing. They've never been in the wetlands or anything. And they're all tentative when they start to get in the ponds to harvest the cordgrass. And, you know, but by the end of it, you know, they come around and they're having a good time. And then they get to grow that grass at their school on campus. And, you know, a few months later, they're planting it in the bay somewhere. So they're just, I mean, a lot of kids in those situations may live 15 miles from the bay, and they think the bay is on Galveston Island, 40, 50 miles away. It's just, so yeah, getting our education programs into those schools has really, I think, hopefully opened the door to a whole new brand of stewardship in the community. And
I think that's important there, you know, because I think one of the pillars of habitat restoration is outreach, and how you do that outreach across the community. It's very important. Tracy, you mentioned military. We have a U.S. military veterans program where we incorporate with, you know, guys from the Korean War all the way up to yesterday they got out, and it's a paid internship. That sometimes changes careers on people too, you know, engages them. And then the one thing, being a former military Air Force guy, we're good mouthpieces. We're good storytellers. We go out in the community and tell them, everybody, what we're doing. We don't care who you are. We tell everybody, and we kind of bring that group together again and have even more diversity in what we're doing, you know, which I think is fantastic.
So something else that we have here too is just within our development program. You know, we're in the Houston area. There's lots of, you know, it's a big industrial area. So if we have a donor that's in the industry, we prefer that it's not just financial support, that, hey, get your employees out, let's do stuff when we can. Obviously, COVID has changed that, but, you know, because a lot of these plant workers, they fish, they hunt, you know, they're outdoors people. So they get out there and they plant and restore intertidal wetlands, and they learn about them, learn how it benefits the fishing habitat. We're just breeding more and more stewards for, you know, for the habitat, and that's, you know, it's that way. It's more than just that company check. They're invested.
Great. We have a lot of great questions from the audience, so keep them coming. You'd previously talked about timelines and funding. So how do you factor in monitoring? Is post-restoration monitoring and responding and adapting to secondary impacts factored into funding timelines, or do you consider that a separate project when you're developing your project? Captain Al, you're shaking your head.
Okay, so we put monitoring into everything. That's another pillar of your restoration, you know, and part of that is adaptive management strategies that you put in there as well. So we do the baseline monitoring. We try to keep it as science-based as possible, and we do. So we're looking at the biological aspects of what we're doing, or the ecological aspects, but we're also looking at the physical characteristics, erosion rates, accretion rates, things like that, and looking at it over time, because that's going to tell us too, as we evaluate those results over time, how do we tweak that project to make sure it's working? Because not every project, it's not one size fits all. You know, everything is can be site specific, but there's correlations and commonalities too that you can incorporate throughout this as well. So we work it into our grants from the beginning, and a lot of times, well, not a lot of times, the majority of the times, it's a condition of your permit. So whatever permits you have, they want to see that monitoring plan, they want to get results, and the results that you get also help you leverage even more funding and connect your on a landscape level.
I would say that it is fair to say that is a very challenging aspect of restoration, important and challenging. We've been required to do monitoring for 5 or 6 years beyond the level of funding or the completion of the grant. And with a small staff, that's very difficult, even with volunteers. One of the ways we've been able to get around it is by writing in university researchers to a number of grants. And again, that often comes with their own funding or match or whatever we're looking for. And we find that to be a nice way to fill that science gap that we just frankly struggle to do ourselves.
But you got to admit too that you can create kind of this menu of scale of how you want to monitor. This brings in your outreach component, your community scientists. You work that into your grant in the beginning, because when your grant funding's gone, that community science program can continue on until you get more funding to continue again with that more kind of monitoring.
It also really builds their stewardship, their sense of stewardship and contribution. And this is good science that these folks are bringing to us.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. You know, a lot of our permits do have some very basic monitoring aspects to them, and that's what we do as a staff in-house. What we found, 15 years I've been doing it, is not a lot of people who fund a project will fund monitoring. They just will not do it. We have seen more recently that people are coming around to that, and as part of a grant, they are funding it and requiring it. And if they're requiring more detailed scientific research beyond our expertise. We have gone to outsourcing that and working with local universities, grad students, things like that to try to get some of that stuff done.
And that's good to see that evolution, because sometimes maybe you just don't go for a restoration grant. Maybe you go for that educational grant as well. So now you're bringing them together. I know we've talked before about how you lay out the creativity of how your terminology to get the grants that you need funding for. And you may be going for a resiliency grant, but you want ecological uplift as well. You may go for an ecological grant, but you want resiliency as well. It's how you pair these things kind of, you know, together and really think about it as you move forward to keep that continuity of that funding and that restoration alive.
Yeah,
And
funding.
also,
Go ahead, Tracy.
go ahead. I was just going to say, we have student interns every semester. Of course, they're virtual for the last year, but that's something that anybody who's near a university or community college or whatever it is, and they often work just for credit hours, which is money to them because they need those hours, and it looks great on their resume. And many of our interns land very well as a result of the work. So they're a great workforce for us.
Yeah, and on a positive note, I just want to say on what you had said, Philip, you know, there wasn't a lot of funding for monitoring or something like that in the beginning. Remember, there wasn't a lot of funding for planning and design either. But now we're seeing it coming through like NIFWIF and others. They're doing planning grants and then implementation grants. So there's a vested interest, if you get through the planning grant, that you may get funded for implementation too, which has been great because we're always looking for money to do the planning and design portion of it, you know?
Great point. So we're talking a lot about funding. So any advice on where to go for funding? How do we get funding for restoration projects? That's always the big question, isn't it?
I looked through so we've been, you know, doing this closing on 3 decades, and I looked through our list of funders and projects just before this meeting, and really we have a real combination of state and federal grants, agencies, and non philanthropic or private funder supporters. I put together just a brief list, but it's interesting looking through it. You have really strong partnerships with groups like NOAA and US EPA, US Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of Commerce, Department of Transportation. And then I believe each state probably has very unique opportunities. I was surprised by the number of state grants that we've had for restoration over the last 5 years. And some of them come out of your agencies that are both regulatory, but you know, whatever the environmental agencies are, some of them come out of unique opportunities that relate to settlements of, they might be legislative issues, or they might be, okay, there's the list. And again, this is not inclusive, but our state has some significant restoration funding around settlements for pollution cases or litigation around environmental degradation. So I think really it pays to sort of search around within your state, because I was really, really surprised in North Carolina how much funding we have through state agencies. But there's lots of federals, and I didn't include any of the private or philanthropic organizations because some of them are very private, and so I didn't include those, but the federal and the state agencies I did on this list.
And Tracy, you in North Carolina, what I've read and what I've heard from presentations, like Dare County and the beaches that they've restored there, that was all done by the municipalities. They raised all that funding themselves. I found that amazing because it was like millions, like $33 million or 13 million, one of those, to do restoration in Dare County, and it was all done by the municipality.
Well, good news, bad news. Yay us for being Hurricane Alley, because, and I say that sadly, but that has brought a significant amount of funding for restoration work that pairs, you know, greater resiliency, greater adaptation and preparedness, because there is this safety aspect of this work that sort of dovetails with our habitat restoration goals. And so yeah, there's been a significant amount of funding through those channels post-hurricane funding.
And the economic driver, because the municipalities there realize that the beach is their economy and they have to have it. We like it because it's a great ecological uplift. There's the dune system, the maritime forest, all that's kind of mixed in together. But yeah.
And it's kind of the same here as well. You know, it's your typical, the federal and state agencies. There's some local foundations and private donors that help as well, depending on what we're doing. One thing that we've experienced here in Texas is with Deepwater Horizon, which I guess it's hard to believe that was, I guess, coming up on 11 years ago or so.
Wow.
Now it's almost harder to fund smaller projects because, you know, there's a flux of funding opportunities through the Deepwater Horizon settlements, whether it was Restore Act, through the NODA trustees. MIFWIF has been a great supporter of projects for us. But with that great flux of funding, you know, they prefer to do larger projects. There's less admin on their end. So that's one change we've seen here is I can do a multi-million-dollar project with 1 or 2 funders, where when I started to do a $500,000 project, I'd have to have 10, 11, 12 grants. So kind of like the hurricane situation, it's something you don't want to ever see again, but it's definitely changed the way projects have been funded in our area.
So you all have been doing many restoration projects over your career, and projects don't always go perfectly. And lessons learned is always really important. I'm sure the audience would love to hear about a time when you had maybe your biggest lesson learned, or maybe a project that didn't go exactly as you thought it would. Any advice or lessons learned that you could share?
I guess one of the biggest things for me, especially like in a living shoreline stabilization, erosion protection project, is just, especially way back in the beginning when I first started, we were kind of doing a lot of stuff by the seat of our pants. You know, meter stick out in the water, trying to see how deep the water is, and kind of eyeballing, okay, that's high enough for whatever on our protection measure, where we're doing a breakwater or whatever, and just doing it that way, not getting those structures high enough, where you might slow the erosion down, but you don't really stop it, and it doesn't give the marsh that you're trying to establish behind it the opportunity that it needs to flourish. So that was the biggest thing for us on a couple of projects, is just, you know, building some structures that may not have been wide enough or tall enough to really be effective in, you know, abating the wave energies and that sort of thing. So it really stressed to me that we need a budget for survey. It's a lot easier to survey, you know, your depth contours, and then at the end of the day, you know, we know, hey, this is the elevation that we need in these different parts of the bay to combat the energy. So a survey on the back end of a construction as well, instead of eyeballing stuff.
Yeah, but you got to admit too, you know, every project you do, you're going to do some sort of modeling. And no matter how much modeling you do, doesn't guarantee the success of that project. You know, you do your due diligence, you come in, and then you start doing your project. But you have to stay involved in that project and use adaptive management strategies as you're tweaking this, because you, like you said, Phil, you're going to learn from that project as it grows, and maybe not in the short term, but in the longer term. And that's why we need to keep looking at our projects, you know, over longer terms, so we can see how we need to tweak them, but also how do we build upon those projects moving forward in the face of sea level rise. So you want a project that you can actually build onto. So what you start with is just a platform for future restoration. And can I say one of my littlest lessons learned? Okay.
Sure.
Always teach your staff to tie the boat to something that's grounded. Otherwise, you not find your boat for about 2 weeks.
That's a great piece of advice. I'd love to hear that story sometime.
Well, I feel sorry for these guys because we've never had a failure, you know, so no, I'm just kidding. We've had lots and lots of challenges. And I would say one of the things I'd say is, you know, funding is very important. It is, you know, you get a reputation for successful work, and then it becomes easier to get the funding the next time. So all of us are a little reticent about being too bold or being too experimental, and yet that's really the key. On projects that we can attract funding on our own lands is where we really experiment, and where they are 50% tell us what we shouldn't have done and 50% saying that looks pretty good, and then sharing those results. And I learned a great deal from the conferences and whatnot, but that's a lesson for us, I think, is that we don't look at anything as really a total failure. It's really moving forward the whole advancement of science and adaptive management when something goes really not the way you would think. Living shorelines, just one little example. We thought we would save on using oyster shells, all 3 layers of a sill, because they're such a hot commodity and difficult to get our hands on. And so we used loose marl as the base layer, but we didn't bag that marl. And on one of our sites, it really just didn't work out, because the bags slid right across it, the oyster shell bags, within a month. And that really taught us that we needed to bag that marl, because the bag on bag friction is what kept them in place. So again, was very instructive. Ugly, but instructive.
All right. So as I said, you've all been combined doing this for 100 years, not anyone doing it for 100 years, but thinking back to when you started, kind of your first year, if you could go back to that first year self, what is one thing you would tell yourself, or one thing you wish you had known when you were first starting out, or maybe a piece of advice you would give to somebody just starting out in this field? Now you have all these years of wisdom and knowledge that you could impart to your first year self.
I'll take a stab at it. I mean, I don't know if I would change anything, because it shaped the way I learned how to do what I do. And just my personality is, you have to do it to learn it kind of a guy. But the survey deal was a big lesson learned for me, and I absolutely would have helped me in some early projects. And the other thing is just patience. And the timeline. When I came into this kind of blind into the restoration stuff, I had a fisheries management background, so more on the resource and not the habitat type of guy when I came in to start doing this type of work. And just I didn't realize that some projects may take 3, 4, 5 years to develop and implement. And I thought, hey, you just come in and say, I want to do this good stuff, give me permission and give me money, and let's go do it. But there's a lot more to it, and just it would have been nice if somebody would have said, yes, this first project you may have completed in 18 months, 2 years, but there's going to be some coming down the road that might take 5, 6, 7 years. So that would have been nice to know.
And I would say, from my perspective, humility is a wonderful thing. Quite a bit of what some of us have been trying to do to move these things forward really means you have to bring folks along that don't know anything about this, or are just learning, or have different perspectives or different interests, and they're not always going to agree. And it is really important to get local experience, local examples. That expression, we don't care how you did it up north, that's the real deal. We really need to work with your local partnerships, your local researchers, your local municipalities, and move everybody forward incrementally, patiently, and in the right time. And it, eventually you're going to get there, but patience was pretty key, and something I was in short supply of for a while.
Yeah, I like that. Patience is key. And speaking the language of your local stakeholders, not forcing a project on them, but engaging them and involving them in the project in a way that you're listening, and not saying, we're going to come in and do this, we're going to come in and do that. I mean, in my year 1 of restoration, I was a private consultant. So I'm driven more by profit and timelines for sure. and I want to get that project in. I want to get that and be out of there. With being as more of an NGO, we can be more thorough about that now and really look at the project from different angles and involve those partners that we need and speak that language and make that project even more of a success. We're not just walking away, we're committed to those projects.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Captain Al, is, you know, when you go into these stakeholders, you know, it's a lot more than just saying this is what we're going to do. It's taking in their considerations and their concerns and being flexible with what you're going to do and let them help mold the project. I mean, that's one thing that I've learned just through our technical advisory committees, where we have multiple agencies, other NGOs that have different, you know, they all have different things that they do, whether it's Texas Parks and Wildlife, who's fisheries, or U.S. Fish and Wildlife, who may be birds, or Audubon, or whoever is. You know, we may go into a project thinking this is what the project is, and it's like, hey, we can do just one little tweak, and it's a better project for birds, or you can do this and incorporate oyster reef into this project, or whatever. So it's kind of letting people. It's not just saying this is what we want to do, and you're here in the room just to check a box. It's you're actually engaged and, you know, being flexible in what you're going to do, just being open-minded.
Yeah, I think flexibility is a great piece of advice when it comes to restoration projects. So I want to thank our panel. I think this has been a great and lively discussion. Thanks to the audience for all those wonderful questions. And I know that not everybody has access to experts at their ready at any given time. So I want to remind everyone, and Hillary, you can put up the website again. We did develop this toolkit to help answer a lot of the questions that were brought up today. Many of the questions that were asked about, you know, funding resources and who to contact and how to get partners. A lot of those questions are answered in our coastal restoration toolkit. Again, the website there on your screen, restoreyourcoast.org. Really invite you to go to that website, check out the toolkit. If there's any questions that aren't answered on the toolkit, there is a survey on there. I really encourage you to fill out that survey. We want this toolkit to be as usable and as valuable to people as possible. So we really encourage you to send us your advice or your questions or on that survey, so we can make this toolkit as best as it can be. So check it out, restoreyourcoast.org. Thank you to our wonderful panel and all your advice and expertise. I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did, and I hope everyone has a fabulous, good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.